I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which this podcast is recorded, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror with Jessicka Anne.
Welcome to Dark Mirror. It is me, your host, Jessicka Anne. Before we get into it, this episode talks about death, grief, and loss, including some reflection on real recent losses in our community. If you're finding things heavy right now, or if you're having thoughts of suicide, this episode isn't a substitute for support. Please reach out to a crisis line or mental health professional where you are. A good place to start if you're not sure is findahelpline.com. Today's episode moves between reflection and two practices, one for meeting grief and one later on for facing death directly. Let's get into it. Today, I wanted to talk about the collective Western relationship with death and loss, particularly that buttoned up, stiff upper lip strand of it that a lot of English-speaking culture inherited. Our community has been rocked in this past month by significant and unexpected losses of very influential voices. And in watching the collective response, often I've felt disturbed, sometimes deeply moved. And it's provided me with such a vital point to pause and look at how we really relate to death and loss, because in truth, mostly we don't. We hide death behind sanitized language and ceremony, while simultaneously indulging in morbid curiosity through fictional stories or true crime. Truthfully, I feel our relationship collectively with death and grief is mostly dysfunctional. And for people who are in the business of people, knowing that this is inevitably going to impact a team member, a client, or even you, it makes sense to look at it. Firstly, your own relationship with it, and also what's been normalized or remains unspoken around you. Because this either gets to become a moment that relationships and connections strengthen, or it gets to be something that creates an unconscious friction, which often manifests itself in isolation, disengagement, and deep hurt. I've experienced this firsthand. For those of you who are familiar with my journey, loss and grief have played a huge part in it, often to such an extent that I was determined to hide it. Being a young widow often meant people treated me differently. I remember sharing with one of my former mentors that I hated telling people because I would see how they looked at me with terror. It felt like they stopped seeing me and started seeing their own worst nightmare, losing someone they loved like that. So I didn't want to share with people what I was going through or how it had impacted me. It felt like they were unable to meet me in it, so I isolated myself. My grieving journey was slower as a result. I felt like such a big part of me wasn't safe to bring into conversation, so I'd hide it. That's not to say that every encounter needed to be a huge outpouring of my feelings, but to feel tense whenever the topic came up formed its own kind of bind in my system. Particularly with my history of people-pleasing, I wouldn't want my feelings to make someone else uncomfortable. So in the middle of these recent public losses, my mind keeps going to the families. I don't say that to diminish what any of us feel when we lose someone who shaped us, even from a distance. That grief is real too. But there's a family living through the actual ongoing loss long after everyone else has moved on. And I think it's possible to hold both, to feel what we feel and to remember that there are people for whom this isn't about influence or meaning, but direct impact in ways that shape their lives day to day. And maybe that's the practice, generally holding what's ours to feel alongside what somebody else's to carry, which makes me wonder more broadly why we find that so hard to do. So if we zoom out for a moment from the purely interpersonal to look at the transpersonal, why is it that death and grief are largely hidden? In some cultures, we see it more integrated, like Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead in Mexico, or Irish wakes where mourners gather around the body of the deceased at their home and exchange stories or maybe even banter. In many ways, our relationship with death is quite clinical, even how we speak to the 5 stages of grief from a pop psychology perspective, like it's some clear on and off ramp that doesn't loop, spiral, or go sideways. Death and grief are messy, organic, complex, and so very human, and I want to support people to know how to share this experience with the person or people beside them in a way that appreciates that complexity rather than caricaturizing it. So why are we so afraid of death? Our own mortality naturally strikes fear in us from our lizard brain level, but it's also the fear of the unknown. We're deeply unsettled by what often can feel like powerlessness when confronting the indeterminate. Maybe partly the lizard brain thing again, but I also feel we have been conditioned towards conquest instead of collaboration. This is where I want to reference Camille Paglia's sexual personae for a moment. In it, she explores the idea that civilization exists in a fight against devouring nature, like an embodied masculine paranoia about being consumed by the wild feminine, the portal through which we enter the world being akin to that which will inevitably consume us, womb and tomb. This mirror shows up again in industrial agriculture and even more recently in our construction of virtual environments, removing ourselves more and more from the unpredictability of nature. So, is it possible our sterile or clinical relationship with death is to distance ourselves from the feminine nature of it as the ultimate surrender, to allow us to conquer death, the pursuit of life? Just look at how much we want to dominate death with biohacking and longevity culture. But what do we lose in our determination to live forever? What do we lose in attempting to defeat death? I think part of our humanity gets lost in that pursuit. If we consider the things we place most value on, it's because they are considered rare. Diamonds with high clarity are precious because they are finite. Like right now, listening to me speak, I'm sure you've not been paying attention to every breath you've been taking, but it's been sustaining you. However, if you ever held your breath too long underwater, the value of a single breath goes up exponentially. Life is precious because it is finite, not despite of it. And when we acknowledge life is precious, we are more likely to recognize this same beauty in the world around us. Which brings me to what really pushed me to record this now. I've seen the recent deaths of public figures really highlight this lack of connection to our common humanity. I've seen it spun as opportunities to extract profit or make a point or even build a platform. I've seen people speculating on other people's private lives in public, unable to sit with their own personal discomfort of not knowing what took place, or maybe even their own grief. I get it's very human to want to understand why, but sometimes the search for why is really just a welcome distraction from what is here now, the shock, loss, confusion, and sadness. And a lot of that comes down to how much we try to distance ourselves from the messiness of grief. One of my mentors once said, a man will run 1,000 miles to avoid feeling the sensations in his body. But that doesn't just impact us. It's what we pass on. It's what becomes normal. So how do we start to meet our grief rather than run from it? The exercise I'm about to share is a simple one, maybe even slightly reductive, but it's the bones of something that can make the tangle feel even slightly more approachable. When faced with grief, yours or someone else's, pause and ask yourself, what am I actually feeling? Because sure, grief itself could be classified as a feeling, but to me, grief is actually a process or even an umbrella term for a set of experiences. Even though it's nonlinear and can vary so much from person to person, it's typically an unfolding of emotions rather than a singular feeling. So what am I feeling right now in this moment? It could be uncomfortable, it could be shocked, it could be sad, angry, afraid. That on its own is a complete use of this exercise. If naming the feeling is as far as you get, that's not about stopping short, that's doing the work. But if you have the capacity to go further, the thing that I would invite you to ask is, what's my impulse right now in reaction to this? The specific behavior you feel called to do. It might be to find answers, it might be to offer an answer, it might be to change the subject. My invitation is to approach this with kindness and compassion for yourself. And this is worth saying clearly, the impulse isn't wrong or something to fix, it's just information. Once you're clear on the specific behavior and if it feels okay to keep going, get curious about the need that that behavior is trying to meet for you. Curious, not interrogating yourself. If you notice yourself digging or judging what you find, that's a cue to probably stop and just be with the feeling instead. I like the Tony Robbins 6 core needs model, definitely borrowed from a very different area of life, but I feel like the needs themselves are recognizable. Those being significance, connection, certainty, and uncertainty, and the 2 additional needs, which for this use case are probably less applicable, but growth and contribution. So here's an example of how this could play out. Skip ahead if you'd rather not sit with the scenario about loss right now. So say you've heard news that someone has unexpectedly died, but you don't know how. You might feel shocked. Your first response might be to want to know what happened, but what need is that desire to know meeting for you? Most likely it's certainty, right? But knowing doesn't really change the shock. It's an attempt to discharge the shock and close a loop which temporarily feels like certainty. So in this instance, is it okay to just let yourself be shocked? And please know that you don't need to hold these emotions alone. There are so many people and resources around you to help navigate these experiences, from those free helplines that I mentioned at the start to professional assistance, allowing yourself dedicated space to receive what you need. Also, in the process of confronting grief, be kind to yourself with emotion cycle. That's often part of the unfolding of grief. I know I've had periods where I thought I was past anger only for it to cycle back about something else in the experience. Grief is really a reflection of the relationship you had with someone, and we rarely have just one emotional anchor to someone who has truly impacted us. And when it comes to someone else who's grieving, one important thing to know is it's not your responsibility to try to fix it. You don't need to. You also don't need to pretend you're okay if it's touching you too. Often the most helpful thing is simply letting them know it's impacting you, not because you're asking them to hold you in it, that's separate, but because it gives them permission to feel too, rather than managing their grief around how composed you are. If you have the capacity to sit with them in it and that's what they want, that's support. If you don't, right now or at all, know that guiding them to connect to people or to resources that can support, that still counts as care. It's still valuable. So I want to change track slightly here. That practice can be very helpful for helping yourself navigate grief or helping someone in their grief. But I want to talk about something now that is slightly different. And I want to be upfront, like any of these practices that I've shared, come at them in your own time. If you're in a tender place right now, this next part probably isn't for you today. You can just let it wash over you, or you can come back to this episode another time. Beyond facing grief, there's value in turning to face death itself as a practice for growth, not something to just plunge yourself headlong into. And I certainly wouldn't go here while you're still actively grieving. It's really important for you to be able to trust your discernment about whether or not you're ready to approach this. That said, I've experienced a lot of growth and awareness, both personally and with clients, by sitting with death as a teacher. One of the simplest ways you can do this is to write your own obituary, and to write it as if you were responsible for reading it at your own funeral. What I've found about this practice is it often brings into sharp perspective what we truly value and want for our lives. So as you write this out, include things such as achievements you'd want to be known for, relationships you'd like to have highlighted, experiences you'd love to be shared, and the qualities of who you are that you'd love to be celebrated. It's important to know coming into this exercise that sometimes it can bring up grief for people you've already lost. Even though it is framed about your own life, that's part of its value. It's not something to fix or avoid, because the chance to sit with the grief again and allow yourself to be with it can often be the very thing that lets you reshape your relationship with life itself. And as always, if it brings up more than expected, like I said before, you don't need to hold it alone. Once you've had an opportunity to write this obituary, and I mean actually taking some time to sit with it, putting on a timer for 20 minutes and giving dedicated time. If it feels right after that, one thing that can really enhance the power of this exercise is to read it aloud to a trusted person in your life. There's something that shifts in you when it moves from being an internal reflection to sharing it openly. Though, if you don't feel ready to do that, the writing in and of itself can often be enough. But what's more important after reading, is how this then slowly begins to inform the way you are leading your life and the decisions you are making. We are deciding who we are every day, and it's important to be honest with ourselves about that. Now, I know I've given you plenty of homework here, but I would like to shift the tone slightly as we are coming to a close on this episode. If you'll humor me for just a moment, there is something I'd love to offer for you to do right now. It's fairly short, but it's really about plugging you back into the current moment and your connection with life. I guess you could call it a sort of a gratitude practice, but not exactly. To me, it's more of an honoring of how interconnected we truly are and how life really is running through all things. To do this one, all you need is to focus on an object or pick an object nearby. It doesn't matter what it is. But then allow your mind to connect with how many hands have touched the object for it to be in your vicinity. The craftsmen involved, the couriers, the farmers, designers, laborers. And as you bring all of those into awareness, I invite you to expand even further, to think about the established networks that made these exchanges possible, both physical as in highways and airports, and also the non-physical such as currency and language and all of these things that really do shape the way that we live, even if we can't touch them. And expanding your awareness further still to contemplate the lands and the resources that made it possible. So many people you may never meet, places you may never go, and yet here it is. Life is emergent. We have the opportunity to participate in that current, including what comes from when we are no longer actively participating. Death isn't separate from life. It's part of the same continuum, like a water drop returning to the ocean it emerged from, but was always part of. I've really been back and forth as to whether or not to name Carolyn in today's episode, and if you're wondering who I mean by Carolyn Elliott or Carolyn Lovewell, the author of Existential Kink. However, I just wanted to take a moment to pause to celebrate her and her body of work. It has impacted me more than I have words to say. My heart goes out to her family and all of those that have been touched by her passing, and may her legacy go on to liberate others just as it helped me in my growth. Thank you for tuning into Dark Mirror. If you'd like to support the show, please consider sharing this episode or giving it a rating or giving us a follow on your chosen podcast platform. Also, if you give the exercises a try or have reflections you'd like to share, my contact details are down in the show notes. My vision for the show is to keep bringing high-quality conversations that directly impact those of us who are in the business of people, so we can lead better, learn faster, and love more. I'll be back next Friday for our episode with teacher, author, and self-proclaimed witch doctor Sigourney Bell, where we look at the breakdown of the mind-body connection, systems of collective dissociation, and the astrological influences behind it. And of course, we go into what we can actually do about it. Until next time, remember, in the words of Martin Pretschel, grief is praise because the natural way love honours what it misses.